Influential. It's a word that gets used a lot in pro wrestling. I mean a lot. Whether it's inside or outside the ring, or even YouTubers and podcasters who like to think that they're making waves when quite honestly they're just ripples at the edge of the ocean. And now that I've gotten my obligatory shot at other podcasters, YouTubers, and peers in this space, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. That's the whole point of this. Just so Andrew doesn't throw potatoes at me. But I'm Matt Ryan, and this is Historically Speaking. When it comes to the most influential promotion of the last 50 years, you have about 4 answers that our generation of fans would go to: WWE, ECW, WCW, and Ring of Honor. While those older than my generation, or those like me who obsess over the classic territory generation of pro wrestling, tend to look towards Jim Crockett Promotions, Mid-South Wrestling, Championship Wrestling from Florida, or even the Memphis territory. Yes, I know I left off one pro wrestling company from this list, and well, it's because they're the most influential wrestling company, in my opinion, of the last 50 years. Georgia Championship Wrestling. The prominence and relevance of the territory actually began exactly 50 years ago. The initial Georgia War went down between the former partners of Ray Gunkel, who had died of a heart attack following a match on August 1st, 1972, and his widow, Ann Gunkel. While Ann was willing to step in and help run the operations that she owned 41% of, her other partners, not so inclined. As one does at the funeral of their business partner, Gunkel's former partners, who technically are now Ann's partners, including Buddy Fuller, Lester Welch, Eddie Graham of Championship Wrestling from Florida, and Paul Jones, the original founder of the company that would become Georgia Championship Wrestling, plotted to take the business over from the now widowed Gunkel. Yeah, they planned to ruin Ann's life again at her husband's funeral. That is some Sopranos level fuckery. Like, good lord. Jody Hamilton, known to many as the father of the referee Nick Patrick, and more famously as one half of the Assassins, wrote in his book about what actually went down per Booker and his tag team partner, Tom Renesto. An hour or so after Ray's funeral was over, Tom called me to let me know who was there. His first words were, "The vultures are beginning to descend on the carcass." On the afternoon of the funeral, Buddy Fuller, Eddie Graham, Lester Welch, and Paul Jones were in Ray's office plotting their plan of action. The following day, they closed down Ray's company, ABC Booking, and started a new company, Mid-South Sports Inc., sanctioned by the NWA for the Georgia territory. The 4 of them had majority control and ignored the fact that Ann Gunkel, as Ray's survivor, owned Ray's percentage points. In fact, they neglected to put those percentage points into the new corporation, never offered to buy her out or suggested any other deal. It was a power play and a conspiracy to rob her of what was rightfully hers. Ann knew that Buddy Fuller, Eddie Graham, Lester Fuller Welch, and Paul Jones all hated Ray Gunkel. When I say hated, I mean it was a real, passionate feeling of disdain. They were not going to do anything to support Ray's family. In other words, even though they were all in the business together when he died, they weren't going to recognize any member of his family as being a part of it. Yeah, that was pretty f***ed up. During this time period was what we would call the territory era, where different parts of the country and the world were divided up amongst a group of promoters, mostly associated with the National Wrestling Alliance. Take notes, because there is a quiz coming up, and if you pass, you will get the secrets to Andrew Zarian's amazing eyebrows. Like, come on, who doesn't want those eyebrows? If you were an upstart promoter and you decided to run in an area controlled by a major promotion, primarily in an NWA town, you were considered an outlaw. Being an outlaw meant you'd get the entire weight of the alliance thrown at you as a way to run you out of business, aka what promoters have been saying that WWE has been doing for the past 5 decades. The problem was, Ann owned 41% of the business and had a prior business relationship with, that's right, you guessed it, Ted by God Turner. Turner had taken over Channel 17 in Atlanta, which would turn into WTCG, or Watch This Channel Grow. And while Ray was still alive, the ABC booking office would get television on his Channel 17 because of Ann and his prior relationship. The issues were that the contract for the television was in the name of ABC Booking, not in one of the individuals' names. According to an interview with Jerry Jarrett, Ted Turner suggested the boys try to work with Ann. Lester Welch, who was Buddy's uncle, was way more easygoing in personality than Fuller. Eddie Graham, a power broker in the NWA, suggested that Lester and Fuller trade wrestling interests. That meant Lester became Ann's partner and Buddy got Lester's interest in Florida. But Lester had no luck getting along with Ann. In fact, it got much worse. Roy Lee, Lester's son, changed the locks on the office, and this was the final straw. Worse than that, ABC Booking would dissolve into Mid-South Sports, Inc., leaving Gunkel with nothing. According to Ann and Ray's daughter, Pam, Ann hopped into her Cadillac and drove to the cemetery in a blinding rainstorm. Her husband's gravesite was yet not fully tended, and in the rain and the muck, she dropped to her knees and pledged, "As God is my judge, Ray, I will never let the Welches win." After making an epic promise at her husband's freshly dug grave, Gunkel started the All-South Wrestling Alliance and started her plan to decimate her former business partners. Per the work of the great people at Pro Wrestling Stories, Gunkel's coup began on November 20th, 1972, when she stole away Booker Tom Renesto, the entire roster with the exception of Bullet Bob Armstrong and Daryl Cochran, along with announcer Ed Caprell and local promoters in Athens, Augusta, Savannah, Statesboro, Carrollton, and Waycross. Finally, she approached Turner and demanded a slot on WTCG, the home of her competitors in the NWA, and well, she got it. And that's what created the 2-hour block from 6 to 8 p.m. and then later 6:05 to 8:05 p.m. that many fans across multiple generations would fall in love with and would become somewhat of the norm of how you structure a pro wrestling television show. So far, we've seen a wrestler die of a heart attack, that wrestlers' business partners try to pull the whole Robert Patrick arc of The Sopranos out from under Ann Gunkel, and now 2 competing wrestling companies airing on the same channel on the same day in back-to-back time slots that also have to tape their television shows in the same studio, hours apart from each other. So they were passing across each other in the midst of a gigantic war to run wrestling in the state of Georgia. You can't make shit like this up. And here's the interesting part. The NWA was getting its ass kicked. It honestly felt like the NWA was the new kid in town, as all the wrestlers, announcers, and personalities that Georgia fans knew and loved were on All South. In his book, The Cowboy and the Cross, Bill Watts even said as much. That first show in Georgia was like working in a vacuum because nobody knew the stars. Some of the top guys in the country, Dory Funk Jr., Hiro Matsuda, Fritz Von Erich, and Jack Briscoe, among others, were on the card. But we were regional promotions then, and these stars hadn't spent the time in Georgia. So the people didn't know them well or how to react to them. The fans just sat there. Watts would also become shadow booker to Leo Garibaldi and be gifted 10% of Georgia by Eddie Graham for coming in and being basically the top guy and booker and writing and producing the televisions and putting together the matches. Garibaldi was booker in name only, basically. While Watts did have experience running Leroy McGurk's promotion down in what would become Mid-South Wrestling after Watts threw his own palace coup just a few years after this, they needed someone who can fight the battle on multiple fronts, not just on the wrestling side. They needed people to make political connections. They needed to know whose palms to grease. They needed someone to run the day-to-day operations of the business. They needed a wartime consigliere. And Jesus, did they ever get one. Jim Barnett started in the office of Fred Kohler, the promoter of the Chicago area and one of the minds who brought pro wrestling to national television via the Marigold Theater and the Dumont Network. Barnett would then move to Australia and develop World Championship Wrestling. That's right, WCW wasn't even the first WCW. For most of the 1960s into the early 70s, WCW was the place for some of the biggest names in the industry, thriving off the popularity of Spiros Arion and Dominic DeNucci due to a large Italian and Greek community in the country at the time. By November of 1972, the original WCW and Barnett were running into a lot of problems, primarily Australian regulations regarding television, flattening out business-wise, and really no growth. Barnett had reached a peak and he was looking for a new challenge. Funnily enough, the NWA would call him in to run Georgia Championship Wrestling. This led to an openly gay man and a single widowed woman engaging at that time in the biggest wrestling war in the history of the business. Think about that. Think about all of those things that I just said in a sentence. If you laid out this story for someone at Hulu, at Netflix, or even on TV, or even for a movie, you'd be laughed out of the room because of how implausible that was. These are people who made Speed 2, and they would laugh you out of the room. But it happened. This is real. There's no documentary about it. There's a lot of great articles. There's a lot of great podcasts about it. There's this video about it. But there's no book. There's no movie. There's no miniseries, no documentary. I don't get it. I don't know why this hasn't been covered yet, but we're doing our job. With Barnett and Watts running the show and Eddie Graham facilitating his announcer Gordon Soley to be the new face of the show, entitled Georgia Championship Wrestling, less than 2 months after it went on the air, the NWA would end up winning the war against Gunkel after less than 2 years. And then, cable happened. That's right, WTCG, later WTBS, would become the first ever television station to be beamed across the country via satellite, making it available across the country, which meant that Georgia Championship Wrestling was the first nationwide wrestling programming in nearly 15 years. 6 years before Vince McMahon bought the WWF from his father, Georgia Championship Wrestling was beamed up on the satellite and broadcasted all over the United States, which meant that Georgia could start moving into areas that essentially had no territories or territories that were near death, which is why GCW would start running in Ohio and Michigan, the latter of which was run by Ed Farhat, the Sheik, whose big-time wrestling faltered as the star/promoter got older and relying on the same tricks week after week after week. With the biggest platform in the industry, Barnett and now Booker Ole Anderson, aka the voice of the Black Scorpion, aka the voice of the Shockmaster, aka a man who has looked 57 since he was 22, and had every major talent in the business passing through looking to raise their profile. With the Georgia War in the rearview mirror, booming business across Georgia, the South, and even the Rust Belt, and millions of people watching every single week on TBS, obviously Jim Barnett and Ole Anderson would put any petty business differences aside and make millions of dollars together and ride off into the sunset as the biggest wrestling promotion of all time. Wait, what's that? Being told by no one that no, that is not how it ended, and obviously you all know that. If you want to learn more about what came next, please, I implore you, listen to the Lapsed Fans multiple part series on Black Saturday. The amount of depth and information they've uncovered is extraordinary, and I am not going to be stealing that. You need to go out there and actually listen to it because it is amazing content. Go out there and find it right now. But we'll give you the TLDR version right here, right now. In 1982, Jim Barnett and Jim Oates were pushed out by Ole Anderson out of GCW because of alleged business improprieties. The problem is, Anderson, who only owned 10% of the company that he bought from Bill Watts when he came into book, didn't own a majority share of the company. And Jim Barnett and Oates, who were supposed to sign under duress, mind you, their voting shares over to Anderson, never signed them over, and Barnett would soon go work for Vincent K. McMahon and the WWF, who'd just bought the company from Vincent J. McMahon, and after an NWA meeting that involved Ole Anderson motherfucking the entire McMahon family and ranting about running Altoona, Pennsylvania to with him, as the younger McMahon planned a national expansion, McMahon also got the idea to take George's TV time. After McMahon was unable to buy the time slot out from under GCW, word trickled down that Jack and Jerry Briscoe wanted to sell their shares of the territory and were referred to McMahon and his wife Linda after the brothers were unable to offload their shares to Jim Crockett and his business partners, the Murnick brothers. There's like 15 different versions of what came next. There's obviously the Murnick brothers version that we just told you. There's a version where Jack and Jerry called the WWF offices to check on Roddy Piper, who got stabbed by a fan. Yeah, I'll say that again. He got stabbed by a fan. Or word just got through the grapevine, somebody talked to somebody, and Jack and Jerry ended up at LaGuardia Airport talking to Vince McMahon, and then soon after that would buy their shares of Georgia Championship Wrestling. And then on July 14th, 1984, this happened.
It's a pleasure to welcome the World Wrestling Federation. Exciting new matches, great competitors from all over the world. And here's the man to tell you all about it. Here's Vince McMahon. Vince?
Millions across the country turned on their TVs to see Vince McMahon and not Gordon Soley on their televisions, and matches taking place in other arenas and not inside the WTBS sports arena. McMahon would add World Championship Wrestling to his ever-growing slate of programming that aired internationally, in syndication across the United States, and on the USA Cable Network, which at the time featured All-American Wrestling and Tuesday Night Titan. Turner wanted wrestling in his studio. McMahon did not. And here's how the narrative of how the WWF and Ted Turner, or primarily Vince McMahon's, issues with Ted Turner would come to the forefront and rear their ugly heads throughout the 1990s. While McMahon and Turner began to very much dislike one another, Ole Anderson would start up his own company, Championship Wrestling from Georgia, airing from a TV studio in Macon, Georgia, soon to be airing on TBS in the morning, alongside Mid-South Wrestling, which, funnily enough, was the highest rated of the three wrestling companies on WTBS during this period of time. Tired of Turner and needing cash to fund his first WrestleMania, McMahon would end up selling his time slots on TBS to, that's right, you guessed it, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, aka Jim Crockett Promotions, who in 1983 could have bought the company and the time slots and changed the entire fate of pro wrestling. WrestleMania 1 might not have even happened. That's right, the company that ended up becoming WCW funded, in a way, the first WrestleMania. So did New Japan, allegedly, but, we don't know all about that, and I'm not going to get into that. To summate, the first and biggest active wrestling war of the modern era was fought between a gay man and a woman. From there, it turned into the biggest television show in the country across cable, being on the first cable channel in the country, hell, even in the world, and then ended up being a flashpoint for the global expansion of the WWF and the first WrestleMania, and then facilitated the Mid-Atlantic Jim Crockett Promotions war with the WWF that would kill Jim Crockett Promotions and end up with WCW, which led to WCW going out of business, being bought by the WWF, enveloping the entire industry for almost a decade, with TNA trying to fight it from behind, and then AEW showing up on where? F***ing TBS. So that's why Georgia Championship Wrestling is the most influential wrestling promotion of the last 50 years. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know in the comments of this video below or on Twitter at @MattRyanYells. Next time we'll have another topic that hopefully won't take as long and involve me writing multiple pages of notes. But until then, this was Historically Speaking, and I'm Matt Ryan.